Kia ora, good morning, Judith Collins. Thank you for joining Stuff.
Oh, you're most welcome. Good morning.
Last week, your new Shadow Treasurer, Andrew Bailey, suggested that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was tipping too much cheap money into residential housing. Yesterday, Grant Robertson wrote to Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr to ask him to include house prices in the Reserve Bank's remit. Was this unorthodox intervention warranted?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, when we've got the Reserve Bank having put so much money, new money into the trading banks, and so much of it, around $8 billion, has gone into existing houses rather than into new housing developments or into business, I think that is actually something that needed to be done. And I noticed that early in the week, Jacinda Ardern was calling it Muldoonist of Andrew Bailey to do that, and a few days later Grant Robertson succumbed to it. So he's taken the right advice this time from Andrew. Should
Orr do what Robertson wants him to?
So I think what he does need to do is to look at that, and I think it is part of his role is to look at obviously the monetary policy. He runs that, but it is a sensible suggestion from Grant Robertson.
However, the problem with house prices, in particular the recent spike, has been more as a result of COVID rather than obviously the Reserve Bank and the long-running shortage of supply have been contributing factors, but it's actually been the COVID pinch. What else should the government be doing, and what would the National Party's emphasis be on getting house prices to a more stable level of growth?
Well, you're quite right that supply is the major issue, of course, in that we have very little new supply coming in, and particularly with the banks being very difficult in terms of lending to property developers to get housing built. That is another issue. But obviously the Reserve Management Act, Resource Management Act, which is something that we have always talked about as one of the big problems and pinches when it comes to getting housing built. You know, the Resource Management Act is something that we've talked about for quite some time. I certainly took it as an issue in the last term of Parliament. The government has the ability to bring about significant change in the RMA Act, and we've said, well, look, talk to us and try and get some cross-party support that's long-lasting and that the property market can have some confidence in. At the moment, it looks like they want to talk to the Greens, so probably if they do that, they're more likely to make it more difficult to get housing built. So just sort out the supply side is really important.
I mean, just going back to Orr for a minute and to Robertson, are you comfortable with the Minister of Finance writing sort of such a public letter, really strongly suggesting that the governor do this, or do you think, are you comfortable with that, or do you think that that's sort of encroaching a bit on the central bank's independence?
Well, it's allowed under the Act. I think it's Section 62 from memory. That is actually part of the role of the Minister of Finance. But I'd also say is that earlier in the last term, that they put it as part of the government's or the governor's mandate, the issue about employment, which is much harder in terms of where the governor should be, in my opinion. But yeah, it's monetary policy. It's really the supply of money and where it's going. These are issues, I think, that are genuine concerns, and I think many New Zealanders, when they look at it, would say, how does it make sense just to pump more and more money into existing housing stock rather than into new housing stock and also growing business? I would have thought most people would have thought that.
Do you think Adrian Orr's doing a good job?
Well, I think he is with what he's got to deal with, and I also think that it's better if basically he's allowed to get on with his job. It's a tough job, and it's a very public job, and he doesn't have that many levers that he can pull. The supply of money and the OCR, basically that's it, what he's got.
Does the National Party support the continuation of central bank independence in its current form, or would you be looking at giving the governor more tools in the toolkit?
Well, I think it is important to retain independence of the Reserve Bank, and that's been shown over the years to be absolutely crucial. But that's why there is this mechanism for a letter to be sent suggesting that the Reserve Bank look at these things. Look, early on in the government's term, they very quickly moved to put one of Grant Robertson's own appointees onto, what is it, the management committee that decides on things like the monetary policy. So they already moved to, in my opinion, to lessen the independence of the Reserve Bank. It was certainly one of the concerns that we had at the time. So I think having moved that way, they now need to do something with it.
So how big of a structural economic issue does the National Party consider housing affordability?
Well, I think it is a big issue. It's a big issue when people are spending almost all of their salary on paying a mortgage or trying to get a deposit in order to get a house. That's why it's really important to increase the supply. So you can't just not have new houses coming in when the population has continued to grow. Obviously not from overseas immigration in the last year, but certainly from New Zealanders returning to New Zealand. I would have thought that's quite a serious issue. It means there's not the money to put into the productive sector, and that is always a concern for an economy that needs to continue to grow.
Should New Zealand be a country where someone on relatively modest means can afford a house? I mean, is that world gone?
Well, it shouldn't be gone, and it's all around the supply of housing and also the affordability of that supply. So if we can build or get built houses quicker and cheaper and better houses than we were building in the 1960s and 70s, I would have thought that was a good thing. I mean, it's not that long ago, before the Resource Management Act came in, when house prices, you can buy on an average salary, you could buy a house that was then about 3 times the cost in terms of servicing of your salary, and now it's more like 9 times. That I don't think. I mean, houses have improved in their quality, but I also think that things have got completely out of hand.
Stuff reported this morning that $2.3 billion of investment is being held up at the border thanks to the government's decision to continue delaying investor class visas as a result of COVID. Basically, no offshore visas are being considered. Is this acceptable?
No, it's not acceptable. And in fact, the government has, as we've seen, mismanaged the economy and certainly the economic consequences of the isolation managed and the MIQ facilities, because they have not actually allowed enough people to come in. They've got space that's available within those facilities and that's not being used. But they've also done things like, for instance, not had the right masks for the staff at these MIQ facilities. They're facing quite a problem, and the downstream effect of that is actually less investment into New Zealand. It's also fewer people who are specialised staff to be able to come in to do the work that is required to be done for our economic viability and our prosperity. So there are some issues that we will be prosecuting, obviously, once we get back into question time, and we'll be doing more of that.
Yeah, because the government says that basically MIQ, particularly up to Christmas and a little bit beyond, is basically running at capacity, and so they can't bring in any more skilled labour. Do you accept that? And what would you, and I think it was actually Bloomfield said that the problem is they've hit labour shortages around staffing these places. Do you accept that? And what would you do differently to try and get more skilled migration?
Well, we've had better results than many countries, but not as good as some. So if we look at a jurisdiction like Taiwan, for instance, and I see now that people are now looking at that, is that they have been able to operate managed isolation and also people in their own homes, living in their own homes and able to be isolated there using technology. And we've been promoting this for months, the use of technology so that we don't have to have people locked up in isolation in a facility when they already have a home that they could be.
So do you think the problem is that the government is running basically a high-cost state-run system where it could...
It absolutely is, but it's also not taking account of the fact that there are other facilities that we have in New Zealand that are currently empty that could be used. I don't think they're trying hard enough, and I think one of the main things that we know is that COVID is coming in through the border, through these MIQ facilities. It's not coming from anywhere else, And that also tells me things like the masks and the health and safety of the staff are not being looked at in the way in which they should be. So there are all sorts of issues here, but the main thing is you can't just keep doing the same thing that's being done and expect we're going to get a different result. And we need more people to be able to come into the country in a safe and secure way, and that's why we use technology, that's why we look at who is doing it better. Taiwan is doing it better.
What other facilities could be being used that aren't?
Well, would be certain hotels, accommodation facilities, there are some like that haven't been used. And when we're talking about staffing, it's important that the government actually looks after the staff they've got now. We've got people saying, nurses in facilities saying they don't have the right standard of masks, then their own health and safety is being compromised. For a start, do that job properly.
Just to change the topic for a moment, Minister for Children Kelvin Davis has refused to express confidence in the Chief Executive of Aurangata, Graham Moss. Should she resign?
No, I would have thought that Kelvin Davis needs to either have confidence in her or get himself into a state where he can have confidence. These issues about public servants being publicly distanced by their ministers doesn't actually help the situation unless he's got a solution to the situation. So he either needs to get himself in a situation where he does have confidence in Grania Moss, or else State Services Commission needs to take that issue over, because she's employed by State Services Commission, not by the Minister.
The issues around Aurangata, the main issue is really the tension between the removal of Māori children, keeping whānau together, and the issue of child safety, regardless of the child's background. On which side of that equation do you err?
Well, we always put the children first, and we have a policy around whānau ora, which we brought in along with the Māori Party when we were in government. Whānau ora is actually all around about keeping children in their own homes or own families and not losing those connections, but at the same time understanding that a child has to be able to be safe. So I know that there are real concerns around Māori children being disproportionately uplifted by social workers. All the social workers I've met over the years, they're actually trying to do the right job. And the big thing for all whānau, all families, has to be looking after your children first. And I think it's easy to criticise Grania Moss and the Oranga Tamariki. It's a lot harder to do a better job than that.
We've got the Commission opening of Parliament this week. We've got the speech from the throne tomorrow. What do you expect, and what's up for Judith Collins this week?
Well, there's a lot of pomp and ceremony this week, and the pomp and ceremony is something that I think is actually a little bit important. It's part of having traditions and remembering that we are one of the few countries in the world that has had a parliament operating really since we were put together basically as a let's say we came together post the Treaty Waitangi. But it's really also important to understand that the speech to the throne is the government setting out its agenda. They failed miserably in their last time they set an agenda, so we'll be looking to hold them to account on what their promises are this week as well. I expect we're going to be a very robust opposition. We are smaller, but I hope that it will be smarter.
On that note, Judith Collins, thank you so much for joining Stuff this morning.
Thank you, Luke.